How's it going, guys? I hope you enjoy your fall break. I hope it was a time of rest. Sometimes it's a time of catch up. So today we're just going to talk about some of the content of chapter 8. I will just go ahead and make this known that there are some slides and some just images I've added in, and that's not on Blackboard, but I will upload like this PowerPoint to Blackboard. Most of the content is the same. I just added just a few slides, and so yeah. So let's just dive into it. As we think about adolescence, I know this is the time where sometimes, as parents or as people, we get a little impatient with students in this kind of age range. Because as children, we can give them that grace, but then when it comes to them being adolescents, sometimes it becomes hard because there are certain characteristics of this stage that are not as pleasant. But I want us to take time to, even as we're looking at this, I hope we can have just a little bit more empathy for those who are going through adolescence. And I hope as you're going through this, even as you're reading, and even as you're going through the PowerPoint, that you can see and hear and even put labels and things to stages or characteristics or features that were descriptive of your adolescence. Or maybe you're there now, maybe you got kids there, but to hopefully this gives you information in turn, but not just that, hopefully gives you empathy and understanding of those who are in your youth group, those who are in your family, those who you may minister to, or those who you may work with. So yeah, I just want us to keep that in mind as we're going through the stage of adolescence. So adolescence is described as just a stage of there is just a lot of transition that's going, a lot of things that are changing really quick for those in adolescence. So first we got that sense of physical development. And the question is, when does puberty start? And at the end of the day, we research has just come up with many different answers. When does it start? But also it varies by culture. It varies by time period, when it starts. And we're still trying to figure out what actually makes it start. But, oh, sorry. Yeah, so they're kind of they're major turning points. So that their puberty can be most descriptive just by those physical changes that are happening. So the body that was a child or preteen is now looking like an adult, and that body is actually now capable of reproduction. There's this hormonal like balance that kind of happens here. Those changes in the hormonal levels that kind of this triggers puberty. So for boys, it's that sense they're producing testosterone and sperm and able, producing testosterone and sperm. But then for girls, it's a sense of that they already have the eggs. It's just now their body is triggered to release some of those eggs to prepare for pregnancy. So at this stage, like boys and girls' bodies are getting ready to reproduce. So those major turning points are the menarche, which is just that first sign of menstruation for like girls, and then for boys, it's that first ejaculation. So these are kind of these turning points, and in this point of adolescence, these things that happen to them. We can see here just from this different chart and how the age range goes for like growth, for like pubic hair, breast development, menarche, the growth spurt. We can kind of see the male and female, the kind of differences here. When I think about that secular trend, so once I already said it, is that in Western countries now, like girls are reaching menarche at a younger age. So in the 18th and 19th century, like in the United States, the average was 17, but 21st century now it's 12.5. So it's age is going down to when people are experiencing reaching monarch for girls, and we can they're more like distinctions. Even there's some cultural distinctions that they talk about in your book, but then also childhood obesity is linked to early sets of a monarch. So this is just a chart that kind of shows obesity among like adolescents. We can see how this trend like is going up and kind of rising, and these stats are a little older, but I imagine if we look at them now, it wouldn't be too far off. Secular trend again. All right. So yeah, so the factors that influence starting puberty later. Now, this is not as we're reading like as fathers or parents to be like, oh, I can stop my kid from going through like puberty. I can stop them. I can slow that down because I don't want them to grow up. These are just factors that are linked, that are associated with it. This is not saying, this is what you do and then like that slows down development. But these are factors. So the father's presence in the home, the father providing more child care, greater supportiveness for both parents, and more affection from both parents for the daughter. So these are factors that are associated with. These are just trends that we're seeing. So things that are common around this age is in adolescence they're very concerned about body image, but there's also a time that sometimes eating disorders form. So you have anorexia nervosa. We've become familiar with that. We just mostly heard it as anorexia, but this is the sense of they're starving themselves. And sometimes it's reinforced by this idea of like, hey, if I can starve myself, like I can maintain this health, this weight, this nice weight, I can maintain my beauty and different things like that. But so they don't eat and then they can't gain weight, and there's a lot of other like health issues that come with that. But that's happens around the time of adolescence sometimes. Then there's bulimia nervosa, which we probably just heard as bulimia, where there's a sense of binge eating and then purging to make sure I don't gain weight. So I eat, but then throw it up. And we can see some trends here. So now we move to kind of cognitive development. So we've heard this name before. It's Piaget. Piaget is coming up here. So we talked about him in that sensory motor stage. We talked about a pre-operational stage, and then your book mentioned the concrete operational stage in chapter 7. And now we're in formal operational stage. We're Piaget once again is focused on that sense of like what their brains are able to do, what their minds are able to do, what are they capable of in this stage. So we're in formal operational stage. So it's the 11 years and up, and they're able to kind of think abstractly. They can handle like reasoning logically. They can exhibit hypothetical thinking. They can combine groups of concrete operations. They're just at this point where like they can think about things on a higher level. They can they have this level of abstract thinking that is now developed. So this is why as you presented, you maybe shared the gospel, or maybe you tried to tell Bible stories to adolescents. They were more able to grasp some of the things according to Piaget because they are able to think more abstractly. They're able to think about the idea of the fruits of the fruit of the spirit, that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control, because they're able to think a little bit more abstractly and reason logically that, okay, Jesus died for my sin because I'm a sinner. They're able to reason logically of it. And then there are also variables that affect their cognitive development. So one of the interesting things it talks about in the book is that it brings up the idea of culture and how kids who were more familiar with their culture and how society viewed culture, particularly African Americans, and they believed that they were discriminated against, they were more likely to achieve much post high school because they were trying to overcome discrimination. So that cultural mindset affected like cognitive development, and achievement. There's culture, there's gender, and there's also like context. So this just brings us back into that sense. I hope as we're thinking about this, we're thinking about, man, this biopsychosocial model and how like there are things around us, there are things that we have that influence us. And Piaget is saying like these things influence cognitive development. So emotions and the brain. So when we think about emotion in the brain, we think about there are a lot of theories about how it works. Once again, I just want to admit as we think about the brain, a lot of people are still just trying to wrap their mind around what the brain is, how it functions, what it does. But we want to understand that in the spinal cell, so if nothing else, we need to understand neurons play a large role in emotion. So if we remember from our chapter that those neurons, they're sending messages to each other. They're sending and receiving messages through axons and dendrites, and those messages and those neural connections are like sustained through this myelin sheath, through this like fatty tissue that wraps around it to make sure like that this message gets to it quickly and fastly. But anyway, so neurons play a large role in emotion. Play a large role in emotion. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the brain too, and how I think a way that can help us conceptualize it in a way where even if we have to explain it to adolescents, a way that may seem more digestible. So we're going to think about it. We talk, in your book talked about that sense of that the prefrontal cortex is developing really fast. It was developing really fast in that concrete operational stage, but now in Piaget's like form operational stage, like the brain's still development in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the higher functioning thinking, like it's continuing like to go, it's continuing like function, it's continuing to grow. And then you have the amygdala. The amygdala is like this place where a lot of emotions are happening. Is responsible for emotional responses. So one way to kind of conceptualize some of this, and a way that I think is just more digestible, is to see it in the sense of, man, this upstairs brain, this downstairs brain. So your upstairs brain, that would be your prefrontal cortex. That would be your engagement, rational thinking. Upstairs brain is for your empathy and imagination. But then you have your downstairs brain. That's where your breathing. That's where your fight or flight is. This is the place where, man, if something happens and your brain perceives it as dangerous, it goes into that downstairs brain, and the upstairs brain is not as available. The upstairs brain, that logical thinking is not online, but the downstairs brain is that emotional response. You go in the fight or flight. You're like, I got to leave, or I got to fight. Instead of rational parts like, hey, let me think about this a little bit more. So an example of that is like, man, you're out in the yard one day and you see a hose that kind of looks like a snake. You jump back so quick because what happens is your downstairs brain, your amygdala, sees that, responds to it from an emotional standpoint, and jumps back. But then your upstairs brain, your rational part, like looks at it now and like, oh, that was just a water hose, because the emotional reactions are so quick. Emotional response is so quick, and that's what happens. So as we think about even adolescents in this stage, that their prefrontal cortex is still developing. It's gaining more like traction and different things like that. But their downstairs brain, their amygdala is doing some work, and it causes them to respond in a more emotional way. So there's a research study that showed adolescents and adults pictures of emotions, of facial of people with emotions on their face. Let's just say it like that. And what we see is that as they were hooked up to like brain scanning devices, that the adults responded more out of the upstairs brain, the prefrontal cortex, and the adolescents responded more out of the amygdala, the downstairs brain. So it just says, as we even think about how sometimes adolescents are seen as like very turbulent, very it's all over the place. But a theory could be that man, they're responding out of more emotions because the prefrontal cortex is still developing. Once again, like I said, guys, I hope this is helping us to develop just a little empathy as we understand just adolescence. See, because here's one of those things that adolescence egocentrism that we can probably know it. We probably have experienced it in our own lives. But when we're around like teens that have this sense of like, I am the center of the world, that that could be a little difficult, because you have the imaginary the team that may have the imaginary audience, like people are watching me and scrutinizing me, and or the personal fable to be like, hey man, I'm the hero, I'm the, or they think of like life in its mythical terms. So that, but you know this, you experienced this, but this is one of those parts that can be very difficult for them. But I want us to understand, man, that this is how they feel at the time. They feel as though, man, the world is, everybody's watching me. They feel as though they're in this personal fable. So it can be hard for them. Can you imagine how hard it is for them to show empathy? Can you imagine how hard it is for them to function in some ways? And can you imagine? I mean, you probably can imagine. You probably have stories of adolescents that you've been around, and you're like, this is exactly what they thought. This is exactly what was going on, and you were like, they just need to know, stop it. They just need to know, stop it. But once again, this is just the experience that they're going through at this time. Just remember, I said, just think about the executive functioning. Sorry, all right, critical thinking. So yeah, their critical thinking skills are developing at this time. And there are two parts of that. There's a convergent thinking, and then there's divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is a sense like, all right, we're going, they're following these steps. There's this one correct answer. Divergent thinking is like, all right, we're going off the beaten path, but we find out that there's more than a couple of answers. Identity in adolescence. So what we see is like, if these are Erikson stages. So that should ring a bell for us as we think about the psychosocial stages that Erikson says, hey, that people go through. And when he thinks about adolescents, think about they're in this identity versus role confusion. They're trying to find their identity. They're trying to figure out who they are, what they are. They're trying to figure out, these very important life questions. So I was thinking, as I was thinking about this, a songwriter, Jessie J, kind of came up in her song like "Who You Are." Now I'm not gonna read those lyrics. I'm not gonna sing them, but I said the YouTube title like down there. But as you listen to the song, you can see like there's this wrestle. There's this wrestle of who I am versus how people see me, and I'm trying. And even you see this, that last part that's just emphasizing just be true to who you are. The sense of trying to find the identity, who you are. But I thought that was really cool, like a song that kind of captured like some of these. So once again, this is Erikson in his psychosocial stages, the identity versus the role confusion. And the main task is to achieve a state identity, something in which one can strive. Trying to find who you are. Because in all these stages, in all Erikson stages, there is what is called an identity crisis. There's something that that they must overcome. There's a crisis that happens that they must get worked through. But Erikson's just saying, man, they're in this point, like either they establish identity or they stay in this thing of identity confusion of who am I, what do I do? So you can see Marcy, she adds to some of this to help people understand that there are two parts. That she adds to Erikson, particularly in this, to say that, hey, there's this crisis and this commitment that a person must come to. And we can see, like she talks about just the stages, that confusion, that foreclosure, moratorium, or achievement, and how she said like people overcome it. And one of the things they say is like, as you think about identity development through like Erikson and Marcy is like it's the experiences that they have that cause that confront their identity. It's the sense of like, man, I went to this philosophy class and it confronted my identity, who I was as a believer, and I have the choice. Like the crisis is the philosophy class and questioning, but then there's the commitment of like, man, I'm a believer, committed to my identity, who I am. So, but you go through different stages here. And here's biopsychosocial theory. So we have heard this before. We should think about this. We think about just even adolescence, that the biological, the psychological, the social are all influencing their development. Particularly, we can say just a distinct thing about puberty is just thing thing about adolescence is puberty. This physical development that happens in the body. There's these hormonal like changes, how the brain is functioning, and there's also psychological and social factors that play a role in that. And then we have social development. All right, hopefully it shows up better on the PowerPoint later. So anyway, we see kind of the role of family. We see even some trends that are kind of happening. So Mother Day is spending more time in the workplace. So than previous decades, mother spends as much time interacting with their children as they did decades, perhaps even more. And mothers generally perceived as more supportive than fathers. So we see kind of this role of the mother. All right. And then we want to think about, man, just even divorce. Divorce happen. It happens during newborn, but divorce is one of those things that really affects adolescence. That if the divorce happened while they were younger, now they're adolescent and they're in between mom and dad, and now they're able to hear some of the things that mom and dad are talking about. Some of these things are starting to make sense to them, and it feels like a lot of pressure for them. And sometimes these conflicts between mom and dad, they really solidify like their relationships with their peers. So they're like mom and dad are fighting, or mom and dad disagree. Will Smith said in the famous song back in the day, he said, parents just don't understand. If like parents don't understand, maybe my peers will understand me. So they go to their peers, looking to find comfort and different things like that. So you got to understand there are things of peers where they have cliques and crowds. You got your cliques, those are people who share similar interests and activities. So you go to them, a close group of friends. Then you got your crowd. These are just a bigger group of people. There's a reputation-based group whose members may or may not spend time with one another. Sexual identity is another thing that's kind of developing around this time. And we can look at this, and there is heterosexual, homosexual, LBGT, and these letters are going out, Q, A, I. There's many more, but during these adolescent years, it's very significant because remember, they're trying to find this identity, trying to figure out who they are, and also they're trying to figure out who they are as sexual beings, because at this point they're beginning to be attracted to their peers, and they're trying to develop their sexual identity, and that looks different. And we as believers, we would see like, man, there'd be some issues and some problems that as we think about sexual identity, that we would say, hey, God has designed sexual identity to function as a certain way, and in other ways may be deviations from the Lord's intended plan. So sexual behavior. So during this time, masturbation is happening for like adolescents, because they're realizing they're becoming more aware of them being sexual beings, and they use it as an outlet, but also their decisions are influenced. Their sexual behaviors are influenced by culture, gender, and geographic location. So remember the statement we said that in adolescence that it begins in biology, but it ends in culture. Just to say like that, there's this influence of culture that determines a lot of things. And one of the things of sexual behavior is that, what are you seeing on TV? What are you reading? What are you seeing around you? Because they're making sense of the world also, to be like, what they're seeing on TV or hearing, like this is acceptable. What are their peers saying about like sex and different things like that? Like this is where they're getting like their input, which makes it more important even as parents to say, hey, I gotta know how to talk to my children about their sexual identity, but also about sex, which, I know it seems like oh my goodness, I got to talk to my kids about, I got to have the talk with them. But it's helpful to have that talk, because if you don't have that talk, they will be discipled by the world and by their peers, which could lead them into in places that are unproductive and unhelpful. All right. See trends in sexual behavior, teen pregnancy. We can see it kind of rising, and also, so we even see like some of these trends, and even how culture, like the cultural like trends and differences here, regional. I'm not gonna go to the stats, but at each point, like teen pregnancy, like the reason I think is very just telling that there's a lack of accurate information the teen receives about sex and contraception. Once again, they are not informed or discipled by their parents or believers in this, they will get discipled and they will get their information from the world. Some desire pregnancy for social or psychological reasons. They're like, all right, this may make me feel better, may make my relationship better. But some adolescents girls get pregnant by sheer accident, by sexual abuse. Now, fortunately, that during this time, and sexual abuse can happen, and it's taken by someone they trust. It's often a continuation, starting during childhood. It's a very serious thing. It happens during this time, and man, and it's so important. And this is why in the classes that you've been now you go through training about like sexual abuse, darkness to light. There's another one, but I can't remember the time. But this is why we go through it, because it's such a prevalent thing and also an untalked about thing. But we as believers, as people of the church, like we need to understand this. We need to be aware of this, because these things are happening with people in our pews, as even when they're teens in the youth group, in the pews, or at Invuge or anything like that. And these things put them at a greater risk for running away, having an eating disorder, becoming a sexual victim, or engaging in substance abuse. Mental health issues are developing around this time, and we can notice just this trend of anxiety, depression, ADHD, eating disorder, autism, cognitive disorders, substance abuse disorders. There's just a number of like stats here. So suicide is also one of those things, and there's just a list of things to kind of to notice there: the depressed mood, substance use, like distractibility, withdrawal from other, sleep apnea. Like there's a whole list of things just to be aware of it, because once again, this is happening for two people that are in the pews in the youth group. To pay attention. It's a very serious matter. We value life, that each person made in the image of God. But we also know people are impacted by sin. These are things we gotta be aware of. Things we need to look out for if people are suicidal, and even I just ask that question, man, are you thinking about killing yourself? Is it very blunt, but also very helpful question to kind of ask if you see someone in a very low state. There's trends again. And then I just put this here. This is just a national suicide prevention hotline, just to be like, man, you can have this, because maybe we don't know how to have a conversation. Maybe we don't know the resource we need to do or what we need to give to people. I think this is just a quick resource. You can say, hey, here's this number. Please call this number. Or I'll call this number with you. And then substance abuse also happens during this time of teenage. I worked in a couple of substance abuse places, and I would get people's stories and the ages they would tell me that they started drinking or using were 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Like they told me all these ages they started young. So if you think about this, like once again, this happened to people who are pews in adolescence, and you see just some of those things. So this is trends once again. Stress, that it can happen even as we just think about, oh, you're a teen, what do you have to worry about? Like you don't have bills that come in your name or anything like that. But man, they're experiencing a lot of things in the world, and a lot of things that are very different than when some of us were growing up. There are different pressures, there are things they're overwhelmed by, whether it be academic, athletic or different things, just feel overwhelmed. They don't know how to handle that. So we want to consider that, and even hopes that bringing us up on a level of more empathy, not just to say, oh, I dismiss and say, oh, you shouldn't have stress because you're adolescent, but to say, man, that they get overwhelmed too, even though their problems in our eyes sometimes seem like, I don't understand it. And then criminal behavior during that time, like adolescence, you see sometimes criminal behavior increases. So, guys, that's the lecture. If you have any questions or thoughts, man, please let me know. I hope as you're working on your iSearch papers, which are due pretty soon, working on your video presentation and your book analysis. Hope you're working. And guys, I really just wanted, man, if I can do anything to kind of help you guys set up for success, please let me know. Anyway, you guys have a good day. And yeah.